I call the member for Charlton.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Members in this place will often talk about the values that define them and their political party. I'm a member of the Labor Party because it is built on the principles of fairness, equality and social justice. It is incumbent on members of the Labor Party to fight against those acts that seek to destroy, inhibit or remove fairness, equality and social justice from our society. This budget is not fair. This budget will worsen inequality in our society. This budget will deepen the divide between the privileged and low and middle income Australians. And true to our fundamental values, Labor will fight this budget. Let me start by calling out the deception of the Prime Minister and his confected budget emergency. There is no budget emergency. Australia has a AAA credit rating, one of only 10 economies in the world. Our net debt is 12% of GDP compared to the average of 74.7% of GDP in advanced economies around the world. Our deficit is 1.2% of GDP compared to the average of advanced economies of nearly 5%. Spending is not out of control. In fact, between 2009 and 2013, this period was the lowest four-year period of real spending growth in 23 years. Deputy Speaker, designing a budget is about choices. This government has used a confected budget emergency to resurrect Margaret Thatcher's infamous "there is no alternative" doctrine. This doctrine was used by Thatcher to rip apart the social fabric of the United Kingdom, and this is clearly the intention of the Prime Minister and Treasurer. The fact is there are many ways to place the budget on a trajectory to return to surplus in a reasonable time frame. There is no justification for the vicious cuts and targeting of the most vulnerable contained in this budget. For example, if the terms of trade follow a trajectory closer to that forecast by the market or indeed the Reserve Bank, Commonwealth revenue will be significantly higher than that forecast in the budget. Another path to budget surplus would involve scrapping stupid and expensive policies such as Mr Abbott's rolled gold paid parental leave scheme or Mr Hunt's subsidies for polluters schemes. For that matter, scrapping the emissions trading scheme not only destroys any chance we have of reducing carbon emissions effectively in this country, it also removes the source of revenue for the household assistance package. These are all choices. There are alternatives. To suggest otherwise is a falsehood, one of these made by a patently heartless and mendacious government. A fortnight has passed since this budget was delivered. I, like many members in this place, have spent much of the time in the community talking to people about the impact it will have on them and those around them. At street stalls, in meetings, on telephone calls and in letters and emails, the message is clear. This budget is unfair. It is unfair because it asks less of the privileged and the powerful than it does of ordinary people and those less fortunate. It is unfair because it supports multinational corporate tax minimisation whilst young people looking for work suffer. And it is unfair because it destroys egalitarian principles that are the bedrock of our society, that every person is entitled to quality health care and education regardless of how much money they have or where they live. Take, for example, Betty, a pensioner from Blackwell's Park in my electorate that has contacted me. Betty told me that for her the most important part of living on a fixed income is planning ahead. She works out her budget well in advance, factoring the cost of household bills like water, energy and rates. Betty is worried about the changes to indexation of her pension because she knows that this means her bills will go up but her pension won't rise in line with them. She is fearful of losing the concessions on her bills as a result of the $1.2 billion cut to the national agreement which supports these measures. In her last quarterly electricity bill, Betty received a seniors discount of $57. Her water bill for the last quarter was reduced by $87. She receives discounts on her council rates, car registration, and she's entitled to reduced fares on public transport as a result of these concessions. On Sunday night, when asked about these concession changes, the New South Wales Treasurer Andrew Constance, a Liberal, said, "I think it is a cruel and callous cut. It is one which needs to be reversed." Deputy Speaker, there are 18,400 people in Charlton like Betty who live on a pension. These are people who have contributed to our country, raised families and paid taxes. They deserve our support. Instead, they face having their pensions and concessions cut as a result of this budget. In the words of Betty, these pensioners have been deceived by this Prime Minister and his budget of lies. This is just one example of the cost shifting embedded within this budget, which transfers responsibility from the federal government to state and territories for a range of measures. Principal among them, of course, is the combined $80 billion cuts to health and education, a move the New South Wales Liberal Premier has quite rightly called a kick in the guts. In the Hunter region alone, almost $220 million in funding will be ripped from public hospitals over the next 5 years. As a husband of a nurse, I know the wonderful work that doctors, nurses and health professionals do in our health system. But I also know that this system is under increasing pressure. Why would this government abandon their responsibility when it comes to the health and well-being of people in my area? Because they are ideologically opposed to public health care, Deputy Speaker. This budget cuts funding for public dental services and bulk billed optometry. This budget raises the cost of medicines for all Australians through changes to the PBS, including for some 42,000 care concession card holders in my electorate. This budget destroys Medicare. It asks every person, regardless of their circumstances, to pay $7 every time they visit a doctor, a measure which will cost the people of Charlton around $6 million in the next year alone. This budget clears a path for state and territories to charge the co-payment for general practitioner-like attendances in hospital emergency rooms. This destruction of the Medicare system has been condemned by countless health academics and economists, including the AMA, the College of Emergency Physicians, Doctors Reform Society, the Public Health Association, the Royal Australian College of GPs, Consumer Health Forum and the Australian Healthcare and Hospitals Association. The arrogance of Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, who believe that they know the health system better than those who work in it or indeed rely on it, is astonishing. Let me quote a doctor from the GP super clinic in my electorate, Dr Wolf du Plessis, whose practice in Morisset bulk bills around 600 patients a day. Dr du Plessis told the Newcastle Herald last week the $7 tax will cause, and I quote, death, disfigurement and disability. Some people will die. Many people who come here don't have money to pay. Often single mums come in here with 3 children all sick. His practice sees people in their 90s who did not have enough money for food. GPs are not supposed to be tax collectors. Last week, the architects of Medicare publicly contradicted the Minister for Health by making clear that bulk billing is not a safety net. It is intended to be universal. They also said there is no such thing as too much bulk billing and made clear their views that there is no evidence that people who will be most dissuaded by price are the ones who are least sick. I will now speak about the shocking cuts to Australian schools, which represent a very clear betrayal of Australian parents, students and teachers. This budget cut $30 billion from education. This is the biggest cut to school funding in Australian history and is clearly visible from the budget papers, Deputy Speaker. In my electorate, schools are angry, parents are angry, teachers are angry. They have 30 billion reasons to be angry, Deputy Speaker.
Whilst robust debate is encouraged, the member should be heard in silence.
Not content with making schools suffer, the budget will also punish universities and those people who want to get a degree. There will be a staggering $5 billion cut to the tertiary education sector by this Liberal government. By deregulating universities, the Prime Minister and his government are making it abundantly clear that they do not believe in fair and affordable higher education. They want to take us down the path of an Americanised university system where you're paying $100,000 to get a university degree. Well, this is Australia, and we're proud of our fair and accessible university system, and these cuts are a disgraceful betrayal of Australian children and their families who should be able to access world-class higher education. These cuts mean more student debt, and changes to indexation in relation to HECS balance will make it even harder to get a degree, particularly for rural and regional students. There are around 20,000 students from across the Hunter region who attend the University of Newcastle, and we're rightly proud of our uni. In fact, the Times Higher Education Rankings recently named the University of Newcastle as the best Australian university under 50 years of age. This draconian deregulation model has been widely criticised by Vice-Chancellors, some who broadly support deregulation. The Vice-Chancellor of the University of Technology, Sydney, Ross Milburn, has stated, "I don't support this budget package because it is a badly designed model of deregulation, plus the biggest funding cuts in history to higher education." The University of Adelaide Vice-Chancellor, Warren Bebbington, observed, "It is starting to look as if the student debt burden for many under the proposed reforms might be well worse than that in the US. Deregulation will become misregulation. And the University of Canberra's Vice-Chancellor Stephen Parker noted, "I also think it is unethical for a generation of leaders who by and large benefited from free higher education to burden the generations behind them in this way. This is a damning condemnation of the government's plans from those who know the system best." And of course, not every student wants to go to university, but the government has proposed similar severe cuts to trade and skills training. Almost $2 billion will be taken out of skills programs, over $1 billion of which were funds to support apprentices. The government committed to create 1 million jobs before the election, but is now abolishing essential services for apprentices and workers. Nearly $1 billion in support payments under the Tools for Your Trade program will be cut, a particularly harsh blow for young Australians trying to get a start in a trade, and many apprentices have contacted my office voicing great concern about this measure. And it's not just apprentices that will suffer under this harsh budget. Families will also suffer. At the same time as their family tax benefits are reduced, they will need to find an extra money in their household budget to cover the impost of a GP tax, higher medicine costs and the fuel tax every time they fill up at the Bowser. Families on Family Tax Benefit Part B will have their payment cut when their youngest child turns 6. The government also plans to freeze the rates for family tax benefits and have reduced the threshold for payments from $150,000 to $100,000. This will mean that a single-income family on $65,000, well below the average age, with 2 children aged 8 and 14, is going to lose over $6,000 by 2016. Deputy Speaker, these are figures by the independent NatSem Centre of Economic Modelling, a centre that Prime Minister Abbott was only lauding when he was opposition as the greatest repository of family income modelling in this country. This cut equates to 11% cut in their family's income. Deputy Speaker, why is it fair that someone on $180,000 or $200,000 a year will pay $400 extra in tax, but a family on $65,000 will lose over 11% of their income? 11% of income, and this cut will be permanent because of this heartless and cruel government. Finally, I would like to speak about the cruel changes to New Start for people under 30. The overwhelming message to these people from the Abbott government is you're on your own. Young people under 25 will now be shifted from New Start payments onto the youth allowance, leaving them $48 a week worse off. After 1 January next year, job seekers under 30 who need New Start and youth allowance will be forced to wait 6 months before receiving any support. This is right-wing Conservative ideology at its worst. It is victim-blaming and it is fundamentally unfair. Deputy Speaker, these appropriation bills are the first step in bringing in some of the harshest budget cuts we've ever seen. These bills are peppered with callous cuts. But whilst essential services and supports are slashed, making life hard for those on low and middle income, there is money in the kitty to pay wealthy women $50,000 to have a baby and increase the non-concessional superannuation cap to $180,000. This budget is about choices. Tony Abbott and Liberals have chosen to hurt the most vulnerable whilst protecting the interests of the wealthy. Labor has made a choice too. We have chosen to defend our legacy of Medicare, of historic levels of funding for schools, of the social wage, of representing the interests of workers and families. We will fight against the abolition of universal health care, increase to the cost of medicines, the petrol tax and the unfair cost of families, students and pensioners. Labor will fight this because these measures attack the very values on which our movement is based: fairness, equality and social justice. I will stand up for the 100,000 pensioners in the Hunter region that will suffer cuts because of this heartless government. I will stand up for the patients in the Hunter Valley who will pay an extra $28 million because of the GP tax. Budgets are about choice, Deputy Speaker. I have a 1-year-old daughter and I want her to grow up in a society that is fair, equitable, where she has the best chance of advancing based on her hard effort and her intelligence, not on the size of the bank balance supporting her. How is it fair to have a $100,000 debt while coming out of university, while those opposite enjoyed free education? And it just demonstrates the hypocrisy of this government that the Treasurer was protesting against a $200 fee for university education 20 years ago, but now is trying to impose an American level of debt on university students. This budget is an attack on the Australian way of life. It results in a 12% cut for family income for people on well below the average wage, while giving a free kick for the wealthy. And Labor will not support it. Labor will oppose it because that's what the Australian people elected us to do, to fight for low and middle income Australians, to fight for pensioners and fight for those who need Medicare most.
The question is that